At 72, I thought I knew the man who shared my bed for 50 years, until a whisper from my 5-year-old grandson exposed a plot that promised to make me rich and dead. You won't believe the twist. I planned to pay him back. Every morning, the ritual unfolded with a sickening precision that had only become more noticeable in the last decade, since Clarence, my husband, had semi-retired. At 72, my bones ached with the weight of that routine, but I, Eleanor Vance, a woman of 68, kept my face serene. I walked hand in hand with my grandson, Ethan, now 5, to the corner where Clarence would catch his commuter van into Manhattan, even though his consulting work seemed a fragile facade now. Clarence, a man who still insisted on immaculate, tailored suits, today a deep navy, carried his leather attaché like a relic of his former Wall Street glory. He projected the image of the perfect, responsible man, the rock of our family in this quiet, affluent corner of Greenwich, Connecticut. He'd offer a quick, practiced smile to the few neighbors we passed, the kind of smile you felt was checked against a list of approved facial expressions. He constantly glanced at his solid gold watch, feigning a schedule so demanding you dared not question it. Ethan, his small, superhero backpack listing to one side, bounced along, struggling to match the long, purposeful strides of his grandfather. Clarence would barely break pace to lean down and give Ethan a hasty peck on the crown of his head before disappearing into the sleek black van that waited precisely at 7:45 a.m. I would stand there, feeling the suburban air grow cold, watching his silhouette vanish. We looked like a picture of enduring prosperity, a model family to anyone observing, yet lately, the ice in my veins had begun to spread. Walking back through the quiet, tree-lined streets, I often wondered if this was all my life amounted to, escorting a man whose life I no longer truly shared, without ever daring to ask what his true destination was. Everyone in our circle whispered about how fortunate I was to have Clarence, a serious, hard-working man who had provided so well that the bills were always paid and our pantry remained stocked with imported goods. The financial security was undeniable, but a subtle, creeping coldness had settled over our sprawling colonial home that no one else seemed to perceive. Evenings were dominated by a silence so thick it felt like an uncomfortable third party at the dinner table, a tension I simply could not name or explain away. I maintained the performance, smiling genuinely at Ethan and meticulously arranging Clarence's favorite smoked salmon for breakfast, all while this strange, unsettling feeling persisted, a sense that the perfect stability we projected was not just fragile, but already cracked and beginning to crumble. That fateful morning, as Clarence marched ahead, Ethan suddenly stopped, gripping my hand with a surprising strength that forced my elderly frame to bend towards him. His tiny, trembling lips formed words barely audible, a confession so unnerving it drove the New England chill straight to my soul. The 5-year-old eyes was a jarring, undeniable shock. This wasn't a tantrum. His expression was far too troubled, far too solemn for a child his age. He stared down at the concrete sidewalk, his small shoulders hunched, carrying a weight that felt treasonous, as if merely speaking the words was a painful betrayal. The sheer scale of the secret pressing on him was palpable. The wave of passing commuters and dog walkers flowed around us, utterly oblivious to the quiet, terrifying revelation that was tearing my perception of reality in two. I managed to stroke his soft hair, injecting a calm into my touch that was entirely absent from my spiraling thoughts, trying to mask the burgeoning flood of raw anxiety that was now consuming me. "Why would you say that, precious? What's wrong?" I asked, forcing a tender, gentle tone into my voice. He refused to meet my gaze, biting his lower lip until it was pale. Then, even lower, barely a puff of air, he added the fatal words, "Last night, I heard Grandpa talking about us." My heart didn't just leap, it seized, as if a thick, ancient bind of darkness had abruptly choked the life out of our mundane morning. I knew I couldn't afford to show the slightest flicker of panic. Clarence, still within earshot, still oblivious, could not be allowed to know that the fragile veil of his true character was beginning to tear. I sank down in front of Ethan, my knees protesting the motion, and gripped his small shoulders, a knot of pure dread tightening in my throat. I had to know every detail. What exactly did you hear, my sweet boy? His eyes immediately welled up, bright blue pools overflowing with fear. And in a voice that shook with effort, he confessed the lines that would forever scar my memory. Grandpa said he doesn't want us in the house anymore, and he has a big plan with you. The words didn't just echo. They reverberated like a deafening thunderclap in the core of my mind. The elderly mind, so resistant to chaos, utterly failed to process this grotesque statement. How could a child conjure something so malicious, so specific? Had he simply misunderstood a benign, adult conversation? I clung to the desperate hope that this was a mistake, a childhood misinterpretation, but the unshakable certainty in his expression demolished my defense entirely. The distant, powerful roar of the Metro North train pulling into the station was the violent jolt that dragged me back from the edge of my trance. I pulled Ethan into a desperate, tight hug, and as Clarence's expensive shoes disappeared towards the turnstiles, the ground beneath my 68-year-old feet truly gave way. The figure of my husband, the man of routine, the supposed provider, instantly transformed into a disturbing, dangerous enigma. What exactly did that plan entail? Why were we being discussed as though we were merely obstacles, items to be removed from a checklist? My head spun with these terrifying, unanswerable questions, but the immediate, primal need was to conceal it all. Clarence must not, under any circumstances, suspect that I knew. I ground my teeth, swallowing the fear that was tearing me apart, and continued our walk, masking the turmoil. When Clarence turned and offered his usual perfunctory wave and smile, I forced my features into a mask of serene calm and lifted my hand exactly as I had done for 50 years. I performed the part of the devoted, oblivious wife flawlessly, even as the terror hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs. My instinct, honed over decades of discreetly managing Clarence's ego, screamed at me to maintain my composure. The smallest deviation from my rigid normalcy could ignite his suspicion and trigger whatever hell he was planning. As he ascended the platform stairs, I no longer saw the reliable man I thought I had married in 1978. His sharp silhouette now appeared to me as that of a cold-blooded stranger, a figure perfectly capable of concealing something monstrously dark. On the walk back, still gripping Ethan's small, damp hand, I tried one last, futile attempt to restore a semblance of order for him. "Your grandfather loves you very much, honey." "I'm certain you misheard," I said, but the hollow, unconvincing sound of my own voice betrayed me. Ethan simply gazed at me, his eyes wide and knowing, and in that silence, a terrifying, silent agreement was forged. He knew, and I knew that he knew. A paralyzing chill snaked down my spine. If Clarence had indeed spoken those words, then we were sharing our immaculate home with someone who was no longer a family member, but a direct and lethal threat. From that harrowing instant, my life became a relentless double act. Outwardly, I was the tranquil, aging homemaker. Inwardly, I was a soldier on high alert, frantically searching for answers. Instead of immediately heading home, I broke the sacred routine, fabricating an excuse about needing to buy Ethan a specific fruit juice at a neighborhood delicatessen, a small diversion to buy time to reassemble my shattered thoughts. The revelation from my grandson was not something that could be dismissed as the product of a childish nightmare. A powerful, insistent voice deep within me was screaming a warning, demanding that I scrutinize every tiny detail of Clarence's life. Ethan's hand was slick with nervous sweat, his anxious gaze a constant mirror of the profound fear that was still consuming him. I managed a weak, maternal smile, yet my chest felt impossibly heavy, weighted down by a premonition of disaster. With every step we took, the chilling phrase, "Grandpa has a big plan with you," repeated in my mind, an inescapable, horrific mantra. My deepest maternal instincts, now grandmotherly, were fully activated, compelling me to protect him, even though the precise nature of the danger remained a shadow. I bought the juice, hugged him fiercely, and resumed our walk, meticulously feigning calm. Though the path home felt interminable, I knew the stakes were too high to display any distress. If Clarence was orchestrating a sinister plot, any sign of my awareness could accelerate the entire, terrible timeline. That afternoon, I began to observe him through an entirely new, deeply suspicious lens, as if the man I had known for 50 years had been replaced by a hostile and dangerous intruder. As we approached the front door of our colonial, my mind was a chaotic blur of desperate, impossible questions. Could Ethan have confused a conversation about a business deal? Perhaps his young imagination had twisted something mundane into a horror. I desperately wanted to believe in this benign explanation, but the more I tried to rationalize, the stronger the cold, hard conviction of the truth became. Ethan's tone, his genuine, raw terror, was not the artifice of a child's imagination. It was the heavy reality of a secret he couldn't keep. That evening, as I prepared a pot roast, the doubt pounded relentlessly within my skull. I watched Clarence, a solid, 72-year-old figure, moving through the kitchen, a picture of unflappable domesticity, and the chilling question settled. Was every kind gesture now just a prelude, a cold, calculated move in his macabre game? I attempted to distract myself, but Ethan's horrifying phrase returned with a new, paralyzing intensity. The silence in the house, previously just a lack of conversation, now felt like a lead weight pressing down on everything. As I placed the plates on the mahogany table and maintained my performance of the perfectly oblivious wife, the realization hit me with the force of an avalanche. I had zero proof, but the trust of half a century was dead. When we first arrived home that afternoon, one detail had snagged my attention and refused to let go. The front door now sported a brand new, heavy-duty auxiliary deadbolt, a piece of hardware I had never seen before, installed entirely without my knowledge or consent. Clarence had never mentioned any security upgrades, and there was no logical reason to suddenly add such an elaborate measure. A deep, sick chill ran through me, as if that imposing lock was an invisible boundary he had erected, separating him from us. Ethan, too, registered the change, his small, worried eyes fixing on the new mechanism, though he remained wisely silent, perhaps fearing that to acknowledge it would be to confirm his earlier confession. We went inside, and outwardly, everything was in its accustomed place. The living room impeccably neat, the dining table set, the large flat-screen television humming with a muted cable news program. Yet, that heavy, silent lock weighed on my mind like an unheeded warning. What was he trying to keep out? Or, the far more terrifying question, what was he trying to keep in? I forced my lips into a weary smile, maintaining the charade of normalcy. But inside, the house that had been my sanctuary for decades no longer felt safe. For the first time, I felt the chilling conviction that my home, this supposed refuge, had been subtly, expertly transformed into a carefully laid trap. While Clarence was immersed in the shower, the hiss of the water a temporary shield, I took the opportunity to scan the living room with the focused, sharp vision of a predator. That's when I noticed a slight, almost imperceptible deviation. A drawer in the heavy oak sideboard was fractionally ajar, as if someone had hurriedly pushed it shut but missed by an inch. I approached the piece of furniture with painful, measured steps, trying to make absolutely no sound, and when I cautiously pulled the drawer out, I discovered a thick, manila folder, poorly concealed beneath a stack of seasonal linen napkins. The fact that the folder was only halfway in, not fully pushed back, suggested it had been accessed very recently. My hands, though steady from years of kneading dough and arranging flowers, now trembled violently as they touched the folder. I pulled it out with excruciating slowness, dreading the evidence that might confirm my grandson's horrifying whispers. As I flicked through the contents, my eyes snagged on official-looking seals, complex signatures, and significant financial figures that my elderly mind couldn't immediately grasp. A clammy, cold sweat erupted on my neck and back. This wasn't the usual, benign household documentation, utility bills, or tax returns. These were serious, highly sensitive papers, the kind that should have been locked away in a safe deposit box. A primal, instinctual alarm screamed at me that I had just crossed a dangerous, irreversible threshold. I retreated to our bedroom, feigning the need to change into something more comfortable, and spread the folder's contents onto the bed. What I saw next stole the air from my lungs and the blood from my face. They were life insurance policies, an alarming stack of them, all purchased within the past few months. On every single one, my name, Eleanor Vance, was listed as the insured, but the sole, designated beneficiary was Clarence. I read the clauses repeatedly, desperately trying to force the narrative that this was just a prudent, late-life precautionary measure. But the sheer, unsettling reality was that he had never, ever discussed these significant changes with me. The purchase dates were shockingly recent, clustered together, and several policies had overlapping or duplicate coverage, suggesting a desperate, manic rush. My heart was a frantic, useless drum against my ribs, making it almost impossible to focus on the fine print. The entirety of my body was now a symphony of danger, every sheet of paper screaming a warning to flee immediately. With a surge of adrenaline, I quickly replaced the folder exactly as I had found it, terrified that Clarence would notice the slightest alteration. I looked into the large antique mirror and saw a reflection I barely recognized, a 70-year-old woman whose eyes were suddenly old with knowledge, a woman who, after 50 years, was looking at the innocence of her own husband through the lens of absolute, chilling doubt. That evening, I could barely manage a few bites of my pot roast. While Clarence droned on about some mundane political scandal, the phantom echo of the insurance policies was a constant, loud buzz in my mind. Why the sudden, excessive need for this level of coverage? Why was I the sole, central figure in this terrifying collection of documents? Every time he smiled at me, that familiar, practiced smile, I felt a deep, sickening wave of cold calculation that froze my very blood. I maintained my perfect facade of normalcy, but the knot of dread in my stomach was a painful, immovable weight. When I tucked Ethan into bed, I sat beside him, gently stroking his hair until his breathing softened into sleep. The calmness of his rest only made the internal storm consuming me more unbearable. I considered the immediate, mad rush to pack and run that very night, but I had nowhere secure to go and absolutely no concrete, legal evidence to justify such a drastic, life-altering decision. I closed my eyes and drew a long, shaky breath, convincing myself that the only viable path forward was to buy time and act with meticulous, elderly caution. The suffocating anguish that surrounded me also served as a dark, potent fuel, forcing me to an unprecedented level of vigilance. The next afternoon, while preparing Ethan's midday snack in the kitchen, I overheard Clarence on the phone in the adjacent sunroom. This was decidedly not a routine work discussion. His voice was low, conspiratorial, yet every word sliced through the quiet air like a razor. This week, it has to be finalized. Absolutely no one can find out, he said with a steel-edged finality that made my skin crawl and the hairs on my arms rise. I froze, holding my breath, terrified that the slightest sound would alert him to my presence. The chef's knife in my hand, poised over a honeydew melon, vibrated slightly with my internal tremor, and a new wave of icy sweat tracked down my back. What did finalized mean? And who was this shadowy accomplice on the other end of the line? The sound of his heavy, approaching footsteps forced an immediate, frantic scramble for composure. I quickly averted my gaze, pretending to be utterly focused on arranging the fruit on the tray. When he entered the kitchen, I met his eyes, forcing an expression of mild curiosity, but after that phone call, every syllable he uttered seemed laced with venom. The call had irrevocably cemented a terrifying certainty. He was, without a doubt, orchestrating something dark and potentially fatal. Clarence hung up the phone with a sharp, dismissive gesture the instant he saw me, as if trying to erase the entire conversation with a single motion of his hand. He smiled, the perfectly normal, husbandly smile, and asked in a light, conversational tone what delicacies I was preparing for Ethan. I answered calmly, my hands clamped tight on the cold marble countertop. Every move he made now seemed rehearsed, calculated, like a mediocre actor playing an overly familiar, dangerous role, and I, too, was forced to become a stellar, terrified actress within the confines of my own kitchen. I offered him a slice of melon, acting as though nothing unsettling had occurred, and he accepted it with a smile that no longer fooled me, not even for a millisecond. The entire domestic scene was a grotesque farce, two aging adults sharing a fictitious moment of peace, while one had a plan for murder and the other desperately pretended not to know the terrifying truth. The deception was a sharp, constant pain, but I knew my immediate survival depended on my patience. I had to wait, observe, and accumulate irrefutable evidence. Prematurely revealing my suspicion would instantly cost me everything, perhaps even my life. That evening, as I meticulously scrubbed the dishes, I made a silent, sacred vow to myself. I would not let down my guard for a single second. Later that night, I feigned the deep, heavy sleep of an old woman, but my eyes remained barely open, tracking his every movement in the dimly lit room. Around 12:30 a.m., Clarence powered up his sleek, black laptop and began to type with a focused, desperate speed. The sickly blue glow of the screen illuminated his serious, concentrated face, giving him the look of a man handling explosively sensitive information he dared not share. I remained perfectly still, playing the part of the inert, sleeping wife, fighting the overwhelming urge to sit up and demand to know what dark secrets were scrolling across the screen. From the pillow, I watched him meticulously delete search histories and shuffle files with a suspicious, almost obsessive care. My slow, even breathing was my only mask against the anxiety that was screaming inside me. I watched him finally shut the machine with a dry, definitive click, placing it carefully back inside his attaché as if it were a priceless, damning treasure. Then, he lay down next to me and pulled me close, a gesture that was once comforting, but now felt like a predatory entrapment. I felt no genuine warmth in his embrace, only a razor-sharp coldness that was a direct, chilling reminder of the policies and the secret calls. That dreadful dawn, a final, cold truth solidified in my heart. Trust was irrevocably dead, and I had to prepare myself, an elderly woman facing down a lifetime of deception, for the terrifying truth that was now rushing toward us. The following morning, as I dropped Ethan off at his preschool, Mabel Sinclair, a neighborhood acquaintance of 65 and a notorious, but generally harmless gossip, approached me with a highly nervous, conspiratorial expression. She leaned in, speaking in a low, almost terrified whisper, "Eleanor, honey, you need to be careful with Clarence. He's mixing up with strange characters, really strange business." Her warning, delivered with the urgency of a true insider, paralyzed me. I couldn't form a coherent response, frantically trying to deduce the source and scope of her sudden concern. Her serious, worry-laden gaze was a terrifying confirmation of my worst suspicions. I asked what exactly she meant, but Mabel instantly backed away, offering a vague, shaking hand wave and quickly dissolving into the chaotic rush of parents at the entrance. I stood frozen for a few seconds, my heart hammering a desperate rhythm, watching her disappear. Those 3 cryptic sentences hit me with the force of an official confirmation. Clarence was concealing infinitely more than I had dared to imagine. I walked the short distance back to our house with a knot of pure dread in my stomach, relentlessly cycling through every suspicious event of the past few days. The secret phone call, the ridiculous stack of life insurance policies, the ominous new deadbolt. Every detail slotted perfectly into a single, cohesive, deeply disturbing puzzle. I felt the paralyzing fear, yes, but also a rising, urgent need to strip the truth bare. That very afternoon, the moment Clarence's commuter van pulled away, I sat down in front of his laptop. My hands were shaking, and I was acutely aware that a 68-year-old woman was attempting a major digital intrusion, but the need for answers eclipsed all caution. I managed to access his primary online bank account. What I found next plunged me into instant, dizzying vertigo, a series of consistent, large money transfers routed to a name I didn't recognize, Linda May. They weren't enormous, life-changing sums, but they were significant enough to constitute a massive red flag. He wasn't just plotting a plan against me, he was funneling money to a woman I had never heard of. I bit down hard on my lip, fighting the hot, metallic taste of tears, but a searing wave of pure, violent rage washed over me. Who is this woman? What was her destructive role in his big plan? Acting purely on instinct, I took screenshots of the transactions and transferred them to a small, nearly invisible flash drive, which I immediately tucked into a secret pocket in my knitting bag. I knew I had crossed into genuinely dangerous territory, a place where legal and personal threats intersected. I quickly closed the computer, wiping the screen before Clarence's key rattled in the lock, and forced the welcoming smile onto my face just as he returned. But inside, the corrosive seed of total distrust had taken root and spread. There was absolutely no turning back now. I needed the unvarnished truth, even if it annihilated the last vestiges of my life. The subsequent days brought the cold, hard confirmation of my deepest fears. Clarence was not merely plotting some dark financial scheme against me. He was also engaging in a blatant, long-term infidelity with this Linda May. The devastating discovery came when he carelessly left his cell phone on the bedside table, an email notification still open on the screen. The message from her was dripping with a nauseating intimacy and complicity, detailing future plans and effusive gratitude for a recent cash injection. The world beneath my feet didn't just crumble, it vanished. The walls of our supposedly safe home seemed to dissolve around me. This wasn't just emotional or financial betrayal, it was a total, crushing deception that had permeated every aspect of my life. I recoiled from the phone the moment I heard his heavy, 72-year-old footsteps approaching, instantly adopting the posture of a busy, compliant wife folding laundry. The agony inside me was a raging, internal fire, but in his presence, I continued the excruciating performance. The sheer number of times he must have looked directly into my eyes while spinning his web of lies was a humiliation too great to bear. This double betrayal, the plot against my life combined with the destruction of my marriage, was unbearable. My life was in imminent danger, and my dignity, the very foundation of my elderly existence, was being utterly trampled. That night, as I lay next to him, listening to the irritating, steady rhythm of his snoring, I made an unbreakable oath I would not surrender to him. I needed to know the full, horrifying extent of his deception and, more importantly, how I, a woman of 68, could possibly protect both Ethan and myself from a man who had become a monster. Later that same afternoon, while meticulously folding Clarence's starched shirts in the master bedroom, I felt a familiar set of small, trembling arms wrapped tightly around my waist. It was Ethan. He looked up at me, his eyes large and swimming with deep-seated fear. His voice, barely a thread of sound, was heartbreaking. "Grandma, please don't let Grandpa know anything. I'm so scared." Those innocent words pierced me far deeper than any knife. A 5-year-old child should not be burdened with such corrosive anguish, but he clearly understood the reality of the danger more clearly than I, in my years of denial, had allowed myself to accept. I knelt down, embracing him fiercely, and silently swore that I would never, ever abandon him to this man. The pure, undeniable evidence of his fear was the final catalyst. I had to move, and I had to move with extreme caution. I couldn't continue to deny the existential threat. I smoothed his hair and offered a forced, shaky smile, promising him, with a fierce conviction, that everything would be all right. But inside, a volatile, desperate brew was boiling. Protecting him now meant fully inhabiting the role of the oblivious wife for every single second of the day. Ethan's quiet plea became a non-negotiable directive. Silence was the only currency with which I could buy the critical time we needed. I immediately set the plan in motion. We needed a safe haven, even a temporary one. I told Clarence that Ethan had developed a nagging cough and that we would spend a few days at my sister Martha's house in upstate New York so he could fully recuperate in cleaner air. I played the role of the worried grandmother perfectly, and to my chilling satisfaction, Clarence raised absolutely no objection. In fact, he seemed almost grateful for my sudden, convenient absence, a reaction that was the final, terrible confirmation that his plan was already dangerously underway. I packed a modest bag of essentials for myself and Ethan and walked out of the house, his small hand clasped in mine, with the profound, visceral feeling of escaping from an invisible, deadly prison. At Martha's house, I found a semblance of fragile respite, but the constant need to maintain the facade remained. I dared not tell Martha the full, grotesque truth, fearing that any careless word might somehow reach Clarence and precipitate his catastrophic reaction. I simply explained that I needed her company and a small reprieve from the pressures of our large house. During those few nights, I slept slightly more soundly, the small, undeniable relief of knowing that Ethan and I were not sleeping under the same roof as that malevolent stranger providing the only comfort. Yet, Clarence's dark shadow remained, a persistent phantom refusing to fade. One afternoon, while retrieving Martha's dry cleaning from the porch, a former neighbor, Beverly, stopped by, her expression laden with quiet, knowing concern. She told me, speaking in hushed, urgent tones, that she had recently seen Clarence entering our apartment building back in Greenwich, but he was accompanied by an entirely unfamiliar, much younger woman. My stomach plummeted, but I forced my face into a neutral mask of elderly indifference, refusing to let her see the raw, devastating pain that revelation inflicted. The description Beverly gave was precise, matching the name Linda May from the bank transfers. My throat seized with a physical spasm at the thought of her brazenly taking my place in my own home. I simply nodded, thanking Beverly for the pointless information. I felt a raging, helpless whirlwind of fury. The betrayal was no longer a suspicion, it was an undeniable, public fact being flaunted inside the walls of my marriage. I stumbled back into Martha's bathroom, closing the door quietly so Ethan wouldn't hear the silent, desperate tears that finally escaped. As I stared at my tear-streaked, aging reflection, I realized a final, galvanizing truth. Clarence wasn't merely planning my end. He had already erased every trace of respect from our 50-year union, and that gave me a cold, hard, unshakable strength. One night, the crushing weight of the unknown became entirely intolerable. I left Ethan sleeping peacefully with Martha and secretly drove back to our colonial in Greenwich. I crept up the back stairs, my heart pounding a terrifying rhythm, and peered through the interior courtyard window. The living room was softly illuminated. Clarence and the same woman, Linda May, were there, ensconced on my pristine white sofa, laughing over glasses of wine. The scene was a brutal, physical slap across my face. My house, my home, no longer belonged to me. He had cynically handed it over to his mistress. I stood frozen in the cold night air, the cement leaching the heat from my bones, unable to tear my eyes away from the blatant, devastating display of betrayal. The way he looked at her was undeniable. This was far more than a casual affair. It was a deeply committed conspiracy. I felt a horrifying cocktail of rage, profound humiliation, and an intensified fear. If he was capable of bringing her into my sanctuary with such arrogant ease, he was absolutely capable of executing any destructive plan against me without a single trace of remorse. I left, the tears contained and sharp, swearing an oath that this was the absolute last time I would watch him from the periphery without taking decisive action. A few days later, hiding again, strategically positioned near the building's side entrance, I overheard the final, damning confirmation. Linda May's voice, now utterly confident and possessive, sliced through the air. Once Eleanor signs the paperwork, the will, everything will be ours. It'll be quick and quiet. That single phrase instantly froze the blood in my veins, perfectly aligning every single piece of the horrific puzzle: the life insurance, the suspicious calls, the new lock. This was far beyond infidelity. This was a planned execution, a full-blown conspiracy for my death and his financial gain. Their light, careless laughter pierced my chest like actual knives. I slapped my hand over my mouth, stifling a scream that would have exposed me, aware that discovery at this moment would mean certain, immediate death. Struggling to breathe, I leaned heavily against the cool, rough wall to keep from collapsing. In that agonizing instant, I understood that my life was in genuine, mortal danger. This was not my imagination, nor my grandson's misplaced fear. This was a gruesome, meticulous plan, and the wheels were already in motion. I turned and ran, not looking back, determined that Clarence would not destroy me. The time for action had finally arrived. With my hands trembling violently and my elderly nerves utterly frayed, I gathered the damning stack of insurance policies, the printed bank transfer screenshots, and, most crucially, the small flash drive. I drove directly to the nearest precinct, carrying what felt like a ticking bomb in my purse. As I recounted the sordid, terrifying tale, the young officer listened, his brow furrowed in skepticism. "Ma'am," he interjected cautiously, "this certainly suggests fraud. But we have no concrete evidence he plans to physically harm you yet." His words were a splash of cold, official water, and I felt the floor drop out from under me. The system I had trusted was denying me the protection I desperately needed. I pleaded with him to take my full, detailed statement, to at least create a permanent, official record of everything I had discovered. The officer agreed to register my complaint, but stressed that without more definitive proof of a direct threat, they would be limited in their immediate response. I left the precinct with a tight knot in my throat, clutching Ethan's hand, swearing to myself that I would never, ever give up. If official justice hesitated, I would find a way to secure the proof myself. Back at Martha's, I remembered a crucial, previously overlooked detail Ethan had shared days ago. One evening, while playing with a recording app on his old tablet, he had accidentally captured a segment of a conversation between Clarence and Linda May. I asked him to retrieve it, and with his small, unsure fingers, he brought up the audio file. Clarence's voice was clearly audible, deep, and chillingly confident. "Once she signs the new will, everything will be ready. It's all in place for the switch." That single, terrible phrase, confirmed by the digital record, was all the proof I needed. I shuddered violently upon hearing it, a cold, deadly current running straight down my spine. The recording was brief, but it conclusively demonstrated a concrete, detailed, lethal plan. I hugged Ethan fiercely, profoundly grateful that his innocent mistake had provided the key to unlocking my survival. I carefully hid the tablet, understanding that this file was now my literal salvation, but that its discovery by Clarence would instantly condemn us both. I listened to the audio repeatedly, noting every word, every subtle pause. It was the last, critical piece of the puzzle. I decided I would return to the precinct immediately the next morning with the recording in hand. That night, I barely slept, consumed by the agonizing thought of Clarence's reaction if he discovered my final piece of evidence. Every neighborhood sound was a potential warning. Ethan slept beside me, and I kept vigil, the tablet pressed tightly against my chest, a small but powerful shield. The next day, the detective listened to the clip, and his demeanor shifted instantly. The initial skepticism vanished, replaced by a look of absolute, grim seriousness. "Mrs. Vance, this changes everything," he conceded, quickly typing notes into his system. I felt a wave of bitter relief wash over me. Finally, the true, mortal danger we faced was acknowledged. They promised to launch a formal, immediate investigation, but issued a stern warning. I had to continue living as if I knew absolutely nothing. I left the station with a terrifying mix of fear and fierce determination, knowing this evidence was our last, desperate hope. The police established quiet, discreet surveillance around our Greenwich home, monitoring Clarence's movements. I had to continue the excruciating pantomime, smiling and living a fake routine, even though I knew I was surrounded by a silent, protective net. Fear consumed me, yet it also granted me the final, necessary strength. My revenge was not just surviving, it was watching him walk into the trap he had designed for me. One afternoon, the detective called. Clarence had been observed meeting with a shady associate in an anonymous bar in downtown Stamford, discussing the specifics of staging a home accident. The news stole my breath entirely, confirming the most grotesque parts of my suspicion. The detective assured me they had more than enough evidence to move in. I listened, my throat dry, imagining Clarence calmly sitting, planning my death as if it were a casual entry on his to-do list. The pain was indescribable, but it was accompanied by a terrible, cold satisfaction. His arrogance had sealed his fate. That public, careless meeting was the final mistake. The officers instructed me to remain perfectly calm until they gave the final word. The weight of that waiting was the most agonizing of my entire 68 years. Every second I spent with him felt like walking a tightrope over a sheer cliff. The final call came on a chilly, overcast morning. The detective's voice was firm, official. "Mrs. Vance, you can finally rest. Clarence has been apprehended." I stood utterly silent, uncertain whether to collapse in relief or scream with 50 years of accumulated rage. They had arrested him in the very same bar at the very moment he was finalizing the details of my staged, fatal fall down the main staircase. The nightmare was finally, irrevocably over. I hung up the phone and sank slowly to the floor, Ethan looking at me, scared and confused, unable to comprehend the scale of the moment. I pulled him into a desperate embrace, swearing that he was safe, that no one would ever harm us again. I knew the fight was not truly over, the legal process, the questions, the social judgment, but in that profound moment, the immediate threat was gone. I could finally breathe. As the weeks passed, I slowly began the arduous process of rebuilding, fortified by the support of Martha and a few trusted, non-gossiping friends. The recurring nightmares of his betrayal persisted, but little by little, I learned to manage them. My survival was my strength. I began organizing my new free life, a new bank account, a smaller, beautiful condo in a safe community in New Jersey, and a new school for Ethan. Every single decision was a deliberate step toward a freedom I had never truly known. I discovered a hard, bright inner strength, the fortitude of a woman who had been betrayed at the deepest level and was now rising with unparalleled dignity. My revenge was simple. I lived. My son is now 7, and when I accompany him to the bus stop, I no longer send off a traitor. We walk hand in hand, and his genuine, carefree smile is the absolute certainty that the future belongs entirely to us. The fear is a receding shadow, but the scars remain as a testament to the battle we won. Every step I take is a profound, quiet victory against the darkness he tried to impose. I look in the mirror now and see a woman who is not only stronger and wiser, but fully in control of her destiny. I don't require anyone's approval. My own self-trust, forged in the fires of near betrayal, is all I need. Ethan is my reason and my driving force. The past is a lesson, and in its wake, the hope of a brand new life is finally blossoming. That is my true, final, and crushing revenge against Clarence. I survived, I thrived, and he lost everything, all thanks to a 5-year-old whisper and a 68-year-old woman who refused to die. I am free. Did you think a woman my age had this kind of fight left in her? What would your final, crushing revenge have been? Tell me your thoughts.